Ma'am, first class is boarding right now, the flight attendant said, her tone firm. Her hand held out as if to stop the woman in front of her. Evelyn Harris looked her straight in the eye. I know, she said calmly. This is my boarding group. The attendant didn't move. Her eyes scanned Evelyn, her pressed navy pantsuit. Her natural gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Her carry-on luggage tucked neatly at her side. And yet, something about her, perhaps her skin, perhaps the ease in her posture seemed to trigger suspicion. I'm sorry. This line is for our first-class passengers only. The attendant repeated, slower this time. As if Evelyn hadn't understood the first, I am a first-class passenger, Evelyn said again, her voice now cool and precise. She reached into her bag and pulled out her ticket. Presenting it like a legal exhibit in court, the attendant barely glanced at it before stepping aside, muttering something under her breath that Evelyn didn't quite catch. But the sting was already there. As she stepped into the cabin, the energy changed. People glanced up from their phones, their neck pillows, their morning newspapers. Some stared too long. Others looked away too quickly. She'd experienced this before, not often, but enough to recognize the weight of it. The sense that her presence in that space, plush seats, linen service, champagne in crystal glasses required explanation, as if she were lost, or had taken a wrong turn, or worse, had stolen something. She approached her seat, 2A, and placed her coat in the overhead bin with care. Before she could sit, another attendant arrived, this one younger, her expression pleasant but distant. Excuse me, ma'am, she said, are you sure you're in the right seat? Evelyn didn't flinch. I am, 2A, first class. She held up her boarding pass again. The attendant examined it, then forced a smile. Oh, I see. It's just, we usually have a frequent flyer who takes this seat on this route. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. And it's just that Mrs. Weatherford usually sits here, the woman said. Glancing down the aisle, Evelyn turned to see a white woman in her early 70s, impeccably dressed, lips tight, eyes narrowed. She was standing 2 rows away, arms crossed, looking at Evelyn as if she were a stain that had somehow made its way onto fine linen. I always sit there, the woman said to no one in particular, but loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. It's practically mine. Evelyn sat down, adjusted her blazer, and crossed her legs. Not today. What happened next unfolded with the slow-motion clarity of a nightmare. The younger attendant returned 5 minutes later, this time accompanied by a male flight supervisor. His tone all forced civility and practiced condescension. Ma'am, he said with a tight smile, we're hoping to resolve a little seating issue. Mrs. Weatherford is one of our long-time passengers, and she's used to sitting in 2A. Would you mind switching to 4C? It's still first class. Evelyn looked him in the eye. I paid for 2A. I selected 2A. I arrived early and boarded properly. Why should I move? He hesitated. It's just a courtesy we extend to loyal flyers. I'm a loyal flyer too, she said. And frankly, what you're doing right now doesn't feel like courtesy. It feels like something else entirely. He glanced at his colleague, clearly uncomfortable. Ma'am, I'm not trying to make this into an issue. It already is one, she said. By now, the cabin had grown quiet. Passengers pretended to check their emails or look out the window. But many were listening. A few pulled out their phones. Then came the final blow. The supervisor left, only to return moments later with the captain. He stood over Evelyn's seat, arms crossed, eyes stern. Ma'am, he said, we need you to cooperate with the crew. Cooperate, she repeated, by giving up the seat I paid for. So a white woman who didn't reserve it can have it instead. The captain didn't answer. He just motioned to the aisle, where 2 uniformed airport security officers now stood. Evelyn breathed in slowly. If you're going to remove me, I suggest you do it gently and I suggest you know exactly who you're removing." One of the officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," without raising her voice, without so much as a tremor in her hands. Evelyn gathered her purse, unbuckled her seatbelt, and stood. The first-class cabin watched in stunned silence as she walked the length of the aisle. Escorted like a criminal from a seat she had rightfully claimed, she didn't make a scene. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. But something in her gaze as she passed the crew steady, unblinking, made it clear the matter wasn't over. 10 minutes later, inside the terminal, Evelyn made a phone call, not to a lawyer, not to a journalist, but to someone far more consequential. The woman on the other end of the line answered on the first ring. "Activate the file," Evelyn said calmly. "We're moving forward." "What happened?" the voice asked. "They picked the wrong woman." Evelyn replied, "Now let's show them why that matters." The hallway just beyond the gate was quiet. But Evelyn Harris didn't pause to catch her breath. She walked with the calm certainty of someone who had spent her life confronting discomfort with discipline. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she made her way toward the nearest lounge. Every step measured, deliberate. She passed a cluster of travelers who had witnessed the incident and now murmured quietly among themselves. A young woman with a baby offered a soft nod of sympathy as Evelyn passed by. Evelyn returned it with a small nod of her own, but kept moving. There was work to be done. She stepped into the lounge reserved for premium passengers, greeted the desk agent with the same grace she offered everyone, and requested a quiet area to make a phone call. The agent, who had heard whispers of the situation from colleagues at the gate, offered a private room without hesitation. Evelyn entered, closed the door behind her, and took a deep breath. She didn't shout. She didn't rant. Instead, she reached into her bag, retrieved her tablet, and typed a short message into a secure legal communication platform used by her team. Moments later, her assistant responded with a single sentence: "All documents are ready. Video evidence is uploading." While Evelyn waited, she opened a folder in her bag, a well-organized leather case labeled with tabs: "Flight itinerary," "Correspondence," "Airline contract." The last one was the most important. For the past 9 months, Evelyn had served as the lead compliance auditor for a federal oversight committee tasked with evaluating discriminatory practices in commercial aviation. What the airline crew had failed to realize, in their rush to appease a familiar face and preserve a fragile routine, was that they had just violated federal non-discrimination guidelines in front of multiple witnesses and cameras, and had done so to the one woman uniquely positioned to hold them accountable. As she reviewed the documents, her phone buzzed. A new message. Attached was a video, just under 4 minutes long, recorded by a passenger seated across the aisle. Evelyn watched it once in full, then again, noting every word exchanged, every shift in tone. The recording captured the moment the flight attendant challenged her seat assignment, the interaction with the supervisor, and the arrival of security. The audio was clear, unmistakable. Most damning of all was the offhand comment from the white passenger as Evelyn was escorted away. Well, at least now things can get back to normal. Another buzz, another video. This time from a teenager seated several rows behind. His father had filmed from the moment Evelyn stood her ground until the moment the captain signaled security. 2 angles, multiple witnesses, no raised voice, no disruption, only quiet refusal met with escalating pressure. Evelyn saved the videos, filed them under evidence, and began drafting a memorandum, not to the airline's customer service department, but directly to the chair of the committee she reported to. As she typed, the door to the private room opened gently. A woman in her 30s, one of the airline's public relations managers, stepped in with an apologetic smile. "Miss Harris," she asked cautiously, "I heard there may have been some confusion on the flight. I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience." Evelyn looked up from her screen, Folding her hands, there was no confusion. She said, "Your staff knowingly removed a paying passenger from her assigned seat without cause, under pressure from another passenger who simply preferred it. That is not confusion. That is misconduct." The woman's smile faltered. "I understand, and I truly am sorry. We'd like to offer you a voucher." Evelyn raised one hand, and the woman stopped mid-sentence. "This is no longer a matter for vouchers. Please inform your legal department that they'll be hearing from my office before close of business today. I suggest they make themselves available." The PR representative stood frozen, unsure whether to apologize again or retreat. Evelyn returned to her work without dismissing her directly. The woman got the message and quietly stepped outside the lounge. The story had already begun to spread. A clip had made its way onto a regional news blog. The headline was simple: "Retired judge removed from flight over seat dispute." Within hours, the clip had been shared thousands of times, with comments pouring in from viewers who recognized Evelyn's face from past court coverage or her years of advocacy work. Some recalled her rulings from landmark civil rights cases. Others remembered her voice from congressional hearings on transportation reform. In one frame of the video, Evelyn could be seen standing beside seat 2A, calmly holding her boarding pass, while the flight attendant gestured toward the rear of the cabin. In another, the security officers flanked her as she walked down the aisle. The contrast between her composed posture and the tension etched into the faces of the crew painted a clear picture, one the airline couldn't easily explain away. By the end of the afternoon, Evelyn had filed her initial report, submitted the evidence to the oversight board, and received a response confirming that a formal investigation would begin immediately. She wasn't interested in public revenge. She wasn't seeking headlines or apologies. What mattered was accountability, measurable, enforceable, and lasting. She closed her tablet, folded her coat neatly across her arm, and left the lounge without looking back. She had already made her decision. This wasn't about a seat. It was about a culture, and that culture, as far as she was concerned, was about to change. Long before Evelyn Harris ever boarded a first-class cabin, she learned how the world measured worth. Born in Montgomery, Alabama, in the spring of 1955, she was raised by a schoolteacher mother and a father who worked nights as a janitor at the local courthouse. Her childhood was framed by the quiet strength of two people who understood dignity not as something granted, but something carried, especially when no one else offered it. As a girl, she watched her mother stitch lesson plans by lamplight and her father come home bone-tired but clean-shaven, his work boots placed carefully by the door. Her parents never complained. They simply taught her, through action more than words, that fairness was a fight worth having even if you never lived to see it won. At 9, she walked her first picket line. At 10, she was spat on outside a grocery store for daring to drink from the wrong fountain. But it was at 14, watching her older brother wrongfully sentenced for a petty theft he didn't commit, that Evelyn made a quiet vow. She would become a lawyer. She would learn the language they used to take away power and use it to give that power back. She put herself through college with scholarships, night shifts, and long commutes. Law school was no easier. But she graduated near the top of her class and earned a clerkship with a federal judge who would become both mentor and ally. Within a decade, she had argued cases before circuit courts across the South, most involving employment discrimination, unlawful arrest, or housing injustice. Her record spoke for itself. So did her silence in the face of the countless slights she endured being mistaken for the court reporter, being asked whose assistant she was, being called young lady long after she'd earned the title, Your Honor. But Evelyn never let those moments harden her. She took the long view. She believed in systems. And more than that, in people's ability to rise when held accountable. Her whole career had been built not on punishing others, but on insisting that rules be applied equally, no matter who sat in the room, which is why, On that flight, she hadn't shouted or threatened. She didn't need to. The truth, when you stand firmly in it, speaks for itself. The call came not from a secretary, but from the airline's legal department directly. By late afternoon, word of the incident had moved well beyond the walls of the airport. A video showing Evelyn Harris being escorted off the plane had crossed 2 million views on social media. It had been shared by journalists, civil rights organizations, and a former state senator who wrote simply, "They picked the wrong woman." But it wasn't the online attention that alarmed the airline's leadership. It was what followed a formal notice of review issued from the U.S. Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights, citing the involvement of a federal compliance officer and requesting all footage, logs, and communications from Flight 1763 within 24 hours. Inside the airline's corporate headquarters, tension gathered like storm clouds. On the 14th floor, the executive boardroom was filled with senior staff legal counsel, public relations, operations, investor relations, all scrambling to contain what had begun as a minor customer service dispute and had now erupted into a national story with federal oversight. The CEO, Richard Langston, a man known more for charm than crisis management, stood silent as the video played on the large wall monitor for the third time. The camera caught everything: the polite tone of Evelyn's voice, the rigidity of the crew's posture, the unmistakable discomfort in the cabin as passengers watched in stunned silence. There were no raised voices, no threats, no erratic behavior from the passenger in seat 2A, just calm refusal met with institutional discomfort. Langston turned to his legal advisor. "Has anyone contacted the passenger directly? We tried," she said. "She declined to speak and referred us to her office." "Her office," he repeated. "She's not just a private citizen. Her name is Evelyn Harris, former federal judge, civil rights attorney, and more recently, one of the lead independent auditors assigned to oversee our equity and access compliance filings with the DOT. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. A few seconds passed before Langston could speak again. "You're telling me we forcibly removed a federal compliance officer from her assigned seat?" "Yes," the general counsel replied, "and the optics are about as bad as they can get." Langston exhaled slowly and sank into his chair. The PR director leaned forward. "We need a statement. Now, something that sounds personal, acknowledges the mistake, reaffirms our commitment to equity," but no one in the room believed that would be enough. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the same airport from which she'd been removed, Evelyn Harris met with 2 attorneys from the Oversight Committee. They didn't speak much. There was no need to. The documentation was complete. Witness statements were already arriving. A passenger from 4D had submitted a sworn affidavit within hours. A couple from row 3 uploaded audio captured on their phone. A business traveler from 1C forwarded photos of the seating chart showing Evelyn's name clearly assigned to seat 2A. There was no ambiguity, no confusion, and certainly no justification for her removal. But Evelyn had no interest in public spectacle. She wasn't looking for press coverage or interviews. What mattered to her was structure, accountability, the mechanisms through which systems corrected themselves. She didn't want one flight attendant reprimanded and one captain placed on temporary leave. She wanted the airline to feel the weight of institutional failure and to respond accordingly. Back at headquarters, a second video began circulating among senior staff. This one showed the aftermath of Evelyn's removal. The woman who had claimed the seat, now comfortably sipping champagne, was overheard saying, "I'm glad that's settled. People should know their place." The words were clear. The intent was unmistakable. The recording made its way to Evelyn's office before it made its way to the public. Her team made the decision to release it the following morning. The effect was immediate. News outlets picked it up by noon. By 2 o'clock, the stock had dropped 11%. By evening, it was 16%. Institutional investors began issuing quiet warnings. A coalition of non-profit advocacy groups announced a public boycott. That same afternoon, Langston's office line rang. It wasn't the media. It wasn't a politician. It was Evelyn Harris herself. "I'm calling to request an emergency meeting with your board," she said calmly. "Yes, of course," Langston stammered. "When tonight? Your offices, my counsel and team will be present. So will several members of the Transportation Oversight Committee. I suggest your general counsel and your head of ethics are in the room. That evening, just after 7 p.m. The boardroom was once again filled. This time, Evelyn walked in first. She wasn't angry. She wasn't theatrical. She was, as always, composed. But the room shifted the moment she entered. Some of the board members stood. Others looked away. Evelyn placed a small folder on the table. "This is not a negotiation," she said, her voice clear but not cold. "This is notice of review. You will comply with the recommendations that follow, or your operating privileges will be challenged at the federal level." Langston opened the folder. Inside was a detailed action plan, mandatory training across all levels of staff, a formal apology not just to Evelyn but to every passenger removed under similar conditions in the past 5 years, a permanent oversight liaison within the airline's corporate structure. Independent of the executive team, there will also be a temporary grounding of first-class operations until retraining is complete. Evelyn continued. The COO spoke up. Alarmed. That's hundreds of flights. Tens of thousands of passengers, millions in lost revenue. Evelyn nodded. You valued preference over principle. Now you'll feel the cost. Part of her felt the resistance in the room, men and women accustomed to offering apologies and carrying on, but another part sensed something else. The faint shift that occurs when people realize they've run out of shortcuts. Langston closed the folder. I agree to the terms. Evelyn nodded once. Then we'll proceed. She stood, shook hands only with those who offered theirs first, and left the room with the same quiet authority she had brought in. The door closed behind her, and with it, a chapter ended not in anger, but in reckoning. The news of the internal overhaul reached the crew involved in the incident within 24 hours. It didn't come as a rumor or a whispered warning. It arrived formally, through corporate channels, accompanied by a direct summons. Flight attendant supervisor Karen Dawson received the email while preparing for a morning departure out of Dallas-Fort Worth. Her screen flashed red with the subject line, Immediate Personnel Review. She froze for a moment before clicking. At the same time, Captain Roland Merritt was finishing a routine pre-flight inspection when a ground agent walked up and handed him a printed notice. It was sealed and initialed, with a time and place. No explanation, no preamble. And for the first time in his 29 years with the airline, Merritt felt something close to dread. They were escorted not to HR cubicles but to a formal conference room at headquarters. The long mahogany table and sterile overhead lighting made the room feel more like a courtroom than a workspace. At the far end sat the company's vice president of ethics and compliance, flanked by 2 representatives from legal and 2 from human resources. There were nameplates, transcripts, copies of policies, and an open laptop displaying video stills. Images paused on each of their faces during the confrontation with Evelyn Harris. Karen sat stiffly, arms folded. Captain Merritt, usually composed and amiable, looked 10 years older than he had the day before. The third person seated with them, lead flight attendant Brianna Shaw, kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, saying nothing. The VP of Compliance began without ceremony. We are here to inform you that your conduct on Flight 1763 is under official review, following the confirmed removal of a first-class passenger in violation of federal travel regulations and company policy. This review includes video and audio documentation, as well as multiple eyewitness accounts. Karen shifted in her seat. We were following procedure. That seat is usually assigned to Mrs. Weatherford. She's one of our top-tier clients. I was trying to prevent a confrontation. You created one. The VP replied calmly, not by enforcing safety regulations, but by enabling bias. The passenger you removed held a confirmed ticket, valid ID, and met every condition for that seat. You prioritized personal preference over policy, and in doing so, you violated not only this airline's standards, but federal law. Captain Merritt cleared his throat. I relied on my crew's judgment. I didn't see the initial incident. I was told there was a disruption, and you did not verify. The attorney replied, You acted on assumption, not fact. That's not acceptable for someone in your position. Brianna finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but steady. I knew it was wrong. She said, When I saw her boarding pass, I knew, but I didn't say anything. I didn't stop it, and I regret that more than anything. The room fell silent for a moment. Then the HR officer spoke. Effective immediately. You are being placed on administrative leave pending final termination procedures. You will receive written notice within 72 hours. Your access credentials have already been deactivated. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. Karen's eyes widened. Terminated. After all my years with this company, you made a choice, the VP said quietly, and it cost us dearly. Within hours, news of the internal firings leaked. The airline issued a statement confirming the terminations, citing violations of non-discrimination protocols and failure to uphold ethical standards. But by then, the damage had been done. The crew members found themselves named in articles, tagged in social media posts, and criticized by thousands of viewers who had seen the videos. For some, it was a public reckoning. For others, it was a personal collapse. Captain Merritt quietly submitted his early retirement paperwork and withdrew from all industry committees he once proudly served. His email inbox filled with rejections from smaller airlines positions he had once considered beneath him. Karen attempted to defend herself in an open letter to a local newspaper, but it was met with more backlash than sympathy. Brianna, now jobless, returned to live with her sister in Nevada and began researching career paths that didn't require a uniform or a name badge. Yet the consequences didn't stop with the individual crew. The airline's board of directors, under intense scrutiny, demanded a full audit of first-class booking and complaint records over the past 5 years. The findings were troubling. There were repeated patterns, passengers of color being reassigned, questioned, or removed from premium seats more frequently than others. In some cases, those changes had been documented as preference adjustments or conflict avoidance. The terms had seemed innocuous at the time. Now they read like codes for quiet discrimination. The board mandated sweeping reforms. First, every staff member, from check-in agents to flight captains, would undergo mandatory civil rights and bias training, designed and led by an independent body. Second, the complaint resolution system would be rebuilt from the ground up, with anonymous reporting mechanisms and third-party oversight. Third, a restitution program was introduced for passengers who had previously filed discrimination complaints, including travel credits, formal apologies, and in some cases, direct compensation. More than 6,000 employees were scheduled to attend mandatory training sessions over the next 90 days. Evelyn Harris, though not involved in their design, was present for the launch of the program. She stood at the back of the auditorium, hands clasped lightly in front of her, and listened as the CEO addressed the staff. This isn't about protecting the company's image. He said, it's about restoring the company's soul. The message was clear: there would be no return to business as usual. Not for the employees who had crossed lines, and not for the passengers whose faith had been broken. Still, there were moments of grace. In one training session, a young gate agent stood up and shared her own story of being told to watch her tone when advocating for a black family whose seats had been switched without explanation. She spoke with courage. And in the room, she wasn't alone. The firings were necessary. The reforms were overdue. But the deeper change, the cultural shift that Evelyn had hoped for, had only just begun. And while the airline's public statements would carry the official tone of apology, the true measure would be what happened next, when no one was filming, when no stories were trending, and when the quiet moments tested whether dignity would prevail over convenience. Change didn't come easily. It rarely does in systems that have operated for decades on quiet assumptions and unspoken rules. But under pressure, the airline began to shift not in surface-level gestures or temporary policy changes, but in meaningful, structural ways that altered how it saw itself and how it treated others. A comprehensive retraining program was launched, not just for public relations or compliance, but because something deeper had been exposed, something that required more than apologies to repair. Every single employee, from top-level executives to overnight cleaning crews, was scheduled to participate in a new mandatory equity program spanning 48 hours of instruction and scenario-based simulations. Sessions were held across multiple hubs, requiring the airline to briefly ground certain routes, including all first-class services for 72 hours. That decision alone cost the company millions in lost revenue and penalties, but it was not optional. It was the price of rebuilding public trust. The program itself was rigorous and often uncomfortable. Employees were shown footage not just of Evelyn Harris's removal, but of other documented incidents involving subtle or overt bias over the years. They were asked to sit with those images, to identify the moment where protocol had been replaced by prejudice, and to reflect on what they would have done differently. The goal wasn't to shame, it was to reckon. In one session, a baggage handler from Chicago stood up and admitted that he used to quietly assume certain passengers didn't belong in priority lines, based on how they dressed or what language they spoke. In another, a senior pilot said he realized he had never once questioned an assignment change that disproportionately affected women of color. Supervisors were taught not only how to recognize discriminatory behavior, but how to respond to it without defensiveness. Managers were instructed to listen, truly listen, when employees raised concerns, even if the accusation wasn't easy to hear. Most importantly, crew members were empowered to speak up when something felt wrong, even if it meant challenging a superior. Evelyn's message had made one thing clear: silence was no longer neutral. It was complicity. But Evelyn understood that accountability, while essential, couldn't be the final goal. Justice without room for restoration led to fear, not growth. So, after weeks of reflection and quiet planning, she announced a new initiative through a nonprofit she had long supported, the Second Horizon program. Its mission was to create structured pathways for airline employees who had been terminated due to verified discriminatory conduct, but who showed genuine interest in learning and reforming. Applicants were required to undergo an intensive vetting process, including written reflections, interviews with ethics counselors, and attendance at a restorative justice forum. If accepted, they would complete a 6-month rehabilitation curriculum that covered civil rights history, cultural competency, passenger rights, and crisis communication. It wasn't a shortcut back to employment, it was a proving ground. To many, the announcement was surprising. After all, Evelyn had become the public face of the incident. Some assumed she would want nothing more than to watch the crew responsible disappear from the industry altogether. But Evelyn never believed in vengeance. She believed in transformation, and she believed that some lessons, once truly learned, could be turned into tools for positive change. When asked by a journalist why she would offer such grace, she replied simply, "Because I was given grace when I was young. I made mistakes. I was corrected. Someone invested in my growth. If we truly want justice, we have to make space for redemption." Among the first applicants was Brianna Shaw, the lead flight attendant who had sat in silence during the incident. Her application included a handwritten letter and a video testimonial. In both, she admitted that she had prioritized protocol over people, image over instinct. "I knew in my gut it was wrong," she said, "but I was afraid of the consequences. Afraid of stepping out of line." And that fear cost someone their dignity. She was accepted into the program. So was Anthony Weiss, a gate agent from a different incident flagged in the audit, who admitted to assuming a black father traveling alone with 3 children must have booked in error because their seats were scattered. And so was Karen Dawson, the supervisor who had spoken so confidently to Evelyn, only to later recognize the harm she had caused. Their journey wasn't easy. The training was emotional, demanding, and unflinching in its honesty. But slowly, they began to shift, not just their words, but their outlook. They were encouraged to visit community centers, to attend listening sessions with passengers who had experienced bias, and to stand in spaces where they were not the center, but the listener. They learned humility the hard way, and they carried it forward. At the conclusion of the program, each graduate was given a certificate of completion and a letter of endorsement. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't guarantee re-employment, but it gave them something rare, a second chance earned, not handed. For Evelyn, it wasn't just about healing the wound inflicted on her personally. It was about shifting the culture of an industry one seat, one voice, one action at a time. 6 months after Evelyn Harris was escorted off Flight 1763, the airline she once quietly boarded had become almost unrecognizable, not because of branding or slogans, but because of behavior. Gate agents who once rushed passengers through without eye contact now paused to greet travelers by name. Flight attendants who might have overlooked discomfort now paid attention. The change wasn't perfect, but it was visible. More importantly, it was felt. The internal culture audit revealed measurable improvements. Complaint rates regarding discriminatory treatment dropped by more than 40%. First-class seating conflicts involving passengers of color declined to near zero. Perhaps most telling, employee satisfaction surveys showed a significant increase in one area. I feel empowered to speak up when something feels wrong. But Evelyn never measured success in statistics alone. She measured it in conversations, in changed perspectives, and in the quiet ways people showed they had learned. On a visit to the airline's Atlanta hub, she walked past a young crew member training a new hire. The trainer gestured toward the first-class seating chart and said, "Everyone who boards belongs here. Doesn't matter who they are. That's the rule." It was a small sentence, but it meant everything. Evelyn returned to her quieter life, spending most of her time mentoring young attorneys and working with nonprofit boards. She refused nearly every media request and declined invitations to appear at conferences or award ceremonies. She had never wanted to become a symbol. She had only wanted to hold one seat that was rightfully hers and, through that act, protect the dignity of others who might never get the chance to defend themselves. In her home office, she kept only one memento from the ordeal, a printed still from the video taken by a passenger during her removal. In it, she stood tall, purse over one shoulder, expression composed. Behind her, a dozen passengers watched, silent witnesses. She didn't frame it for pride. She kept it as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is the refusal to move, not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. The Second Horizon program continued to grow. Other industries took note. A regional train line implemented a similar model. A hotel chain reached out for consultation. The idea that discipline could include redemption began to take root in places that had long equated error with exile. As for Evelyn, she made no public declaration, no final statement. Her life remained as it had always been, grounded in clarity, calm, and an unshakable sense of purpose. She hadn't changed the world, not all at once, but she had tilted it, just slightly, in the direction of fairness. And for those who had watched what happened, those who had learned from it, and those who would come after, that tilt made all the difference. If this story spoke to you, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Every voice helps keep dignity and fairness alive, and if you believe in standing up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable, consider subscribing to this channel. Thank you for watching. Stay kind. Stay steady, and never forget, quiet courage can change everything.